It started with a cup of coffee. November 18th, 1953. A cabin deep in the forests of Frederick, Maryland. 10 men seated around a table, all of them scientists, all of them employed by the United States government. Outside, the trees had lost their leaves. The cold had settled in early that year. Nobody at that table was supposed to be there. The meeting didn't exist, and what they were about to decide would not appear in any official record for the next 22 years. After hours of discussion, they reached a conclusion. A simple one, really, almost clinical in the way it was phrased. They wrote it down in a document that would eventually be declassified decades later and read by anyone with enough patience to file the right paperwork. An unwitting experiment would be desirable. Unwitting. That was the word they used. Not volunteer, not consenting, not informed. Unwitting. Which is a clinical way of saying they wanted to dose people with one of the most powerful psychoactive substances ever discovered, without those people knowing it was happening. Without asking, without warning, without any intention of ever telling them. And they did. For 20 years, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America ran a secret program called MKUltra. A program with 149 documented sub-projects. A program that spent the equivalent of nearly $90 million in today's money. A program that operated inside universities, hospitals, prisons, and ordinary American homes. A program that used American citizens and foreign nationals as test subjects, without their knowledge, without their consent, without any accountability, until 1973, when the man who ran the CIA ordered every single file to be destroyed. He almost succeeded. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not speculation. It is not the product of someone connecting dots that don't belong together. Everything in this story comes from declassified government documents, Senate testimony, court records, and the sworn statements of the men who ran this program themselves. This is the true story of MKUltra, and it begins, as so many American nightmares do, with a fear. The year is 1947. World War II has ended. The Soviet Union and the United States are locked in a new kind of conflict. One fought not with armies, but with information, technology, and the terrifying question of who will get there first. And in the late 1940s, the CIA received a report that sent a quiet panic through its highest levels. The Soviets, the report said, had been making intensive efforts to produce a chemical compound called lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Not only that, the Soviets had allegedly tried to purchase the world's entire supply of the substance. One CIA officer later testified, and this is a direct quote from congressional records, that the agency was, in his words, literally terrified. Terrified. Not concerned, not alarmed, terrified. Because LSD, this strange Swiss invention that had only been discovered by accident in 1943, seemed to do something that no other substance had ever done. It didn't just alter mood, it didn't just numb pain. It dismantled the very architecture of the mind. It broke down the walls between what a person believed to be true and what they could be made to believe. It made people suggestible in ways that scientists were only beginning to understand. And the CIA had one thought, and one thought only. If the Soviets have this, if they can use this on our agents, on our soldiers, on our politicians, we have no defense, unless we understand it first. That was the fear. That was the justification. That was the door through which everything that followed walked. In 1953, a man named Sidney Gottlieb was given the keys to that door. He was 35 years old. He had a PhD in chemistry from Caltech. He walked with a club foot. He stuttered slightly. He kept goats on a farm in rural Virginia and made his own yogurt. He practiced folk dancing on weekends. By every account, he was a gentle, curious man. He was also, as one historian would later call him, the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. Under Gottlieb's direction, MKUltra would grow from a single question, What does LSD do to the human mind? Into a vast and sprawling apparatus of human experimentation. It would reach into 30 institutions across the United States and Canada. It would fund research at Harvard, at Columbia, at Stanford. It would operate inside federal prisons, inside psychiatric hospitals, inside ordinary apartments in San Francisco and New York City. And at every level, the same principle applied. The subjects did not need to know. This is their story. And the story of what was done to them. Stay with me. To understand MKUltra, you need to understand one man. Sidney Gottlieb was born in 1918 in the Bronx, New York, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants. He overcame a clubfoot and a stutter to become one of the most accomplished chemists of his generation. By the time the CIA recruited him in 1951, he was already deeply embedded in the world of covert chemical research. In the early 1950s, Gottlieb made a decision that would define his career and change American history. He arranged for the CIA to spend $240,000, the equivalent of roughly $2 million today, to purchase the world's entire existing supply of LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz. All of it. Every single dose on the planet. He then began distributing it, quietly, through networks of bogus research foundations and front organizations, to hospitals, universities, prisons, and clinics across America. The researchers who received it were told they were participating in legitimate scientific studies. Some knew they were working for the CIA. Many did not. And the subjects, the patients, the prisoners, the ordinary people who were given this substance, almost none of them knew anything at all. Gottlieb's logic was this: to understand what LSD did to the human mind, you had to observe it in conditions that were real. Not sterile laboratory conditions where the subject was calm and prepared. Real conditions. Conditions of stress. Conditions of fear. Conditions where the subject had no idea what was happening to them. Because that, he argued, was how it would be used in the field. An enemy agent wouldn't be warned. A foreign leader targeted for manipulation wouldn't be told. A Soviet interrogator slipping something into a drink at a diplomatic function wouldn't announce it first. So the experiments had to be the same. There is a document, declassified, available to the public, from November 1953. The same month as that cabin meeting in Maryland. It describes the objectives of the LSD research in clear, bureaucratic language. The CIA wanted to identify drugs that could, and I am quoting directly here, produce amnesia, distort the sense of time, heighten suggestibility, create confusion, lower the ability to resist instruction, and eliminate the will of the person being examined. Eliminate the will. That was the goal. Not to cure, not to heal, not to understand suffering, to eliminate the will. And they pursued it with extraordinary thoroughness. In the early days, the experiments were relatively contained. CIA officers would dose each other. Volunteers were recruited, though the true nature of the experiments was rarely disclosed. Gottlieb himself took LSD on multiple occasions, as both witting and unwitting subject. But the program grew. And as it grew, so did its reach, and its willingness to use people who had no idea they were being used. The most vulnerable were always the first targets. In a federal hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, a facility that housed people with drug addictions, a CIA-funded researcher named Harris Isbell ran a series of experiments that would not be out of place in accounts of wartime atrocities. Isbell administered LSD to 7 patients, nearly all of them black men, for 77 consecutive days, every day, without stopping. When the patients built up a tolerance to the drug, when it stopped working as intended, Isbell doubled the dose, then tripled it, then quadrupled it. 77 days. He later published his findings in scientific journals, without once mentioning that his subjects had not consented, without once mentioning that the CIA had funded his work, without once mentioning that the men in his care had been selected in part because they were already prisoners of their addiction, and therefore in no position to say no. At a prison in Atlanta, heroin-addicted inmates were offered a deal. Participate in our experiments, and we will give you more heroin. They were given LSD. Their reactions were observed, The heroin was provided as promised. At a hospital in Canada, a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron was conducting experiments that would later be described as some of the most psychologically destructive ever carried out in the name of science. Funded in part by the CIA through a front organization, Cameron subjected his patients to what he called psychic driving. Continuous, looping audio messages played into their ears for hours, days, sometimes weeks at a time, while they were kept in drug-induced sleep states with LSD barbiturates and electroconvulsive shock therapy. His goal was to wipe the mind clean, to erase the existing personality and, in theory, replace it with something new. One of his patients entered his care with mild anxiety. She left, months later, unable to remember her own children's names. This was MKUltra. This was what the CIA funded, authorized, and for 20 years kept entirely secret from the American people. In 1955, at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco, California, the CIA was renovating a bedroom. The man overseeing the renovation was George Hunter White. He was not an interior decorator. He was a federal narcotics agent, former OSS operative, veteran of wartime covert operations, and by most accounts, a man who genuinely enjoyed his work. White had been recruited by Sidney Gottlieb specifically for this project, because Gottlieb had a problem. The laboratory experiments were producing data, but they had limits. In a controlled setting, subjects knew they were being observed. Their reactions were shaped by that knowledge. What Gottlieb needed was something harder to arrange. He needed to see what LSD did to completely unsuspecting people in completely uncontrolled situations. White's solution was elegant, in a deeply corrupt sort of way. He hired prostitutes. He set them up in the apartment on Chestnut Street. He told them their job was to bring men back to the apartment, clients, strangers, whoever they could find. Once the men were inside, the women would slip LSD into their drinks, without warning, without consent, without any way for the men to know that their evening had just become a government experiment. White sat behind a two-way mirror, martini in hand, and watched. He took notes. He filed reports. He submitted his findings to Sidney Gottlieb and the technical services staff of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. The operation ran for several years. A second safe house was opened in New York City. The prostitutes were paid in cash and protected from arrest. White described his work, in a letter written after he retired, with words that have no equivalent in the clinical language of government documents. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and the blessing of the All-Highest? Those are his words, preserved in the historical record. The men who were dosed in those apartments, the men who walked in for one thing and had something entirely different done to them without their knowledge, never knew what had happened to them. Many of them would have had no way of understanding what they experienced. LSD was not known to the general public in 1955. If you woke up the next morning confused, disoriented, certain that the walls had moved and that time itself had bent, you would have had no framework for understanding it. You would simply think you were losing your mind. And the CIA would have moved on to the next subject. But Operation Midnight Climax was not the darkest chapter of MKUltra. It was not even close. That distinction belongs to a single night, a single man, and a single decision that would haunt the American government for decades. His name was Frank Olson. Frank Olson was 43 years old in November 1953. He was a biochemist working for the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the military center for biological weapons research. He was one of 10 scientists who attended that cabin meeting in the Frederick Forest on November 18th. He was also, at some point during that meeting, secretly dosed with LSD, without being told, without consenting. One of his colleagues slipped it into his drink. This was, apparently, standard practice within the program. Testing colleagues, testing subordinates, testing anyone who might need to know what the drug did, without giving them the chance to prepare themselves mentally for what was coming. Olson had a terrible reaction. In the days that followed, he became deeply paranoid. He told his wife he had made a terrible mistake. He told colleagues he wanted to leave the CIA program entirely. He grew withdrawn, agitated, unable to sleep. The CIA sent him to New York City to see a doctor, a psychiatrist who was himself deeply embedded in the MKUltra program. The doctor gave Olson more drugs, and then arranged for him to stay in a room at the Hotel Statler in Manhattan. On the morning of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson fell from the window of his room on the 13th floor. He was dead before he hit the ground. The CIA told his family it was a suicide. His wife and children were told he had jumped. They were told he had been struggling. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about the experiment. They were not told about any of it. For more than 20 years, they believed the official story. It wasn't until 1975, when congressional investigators began picking through the ruins of MKUltra's shredded files, that the truth began to surface. The family was eventually informed. A settlement was reached. An apology was issued. Frank Olson's son, Eric, has spent decades arguing that his father was not simply a tragic accident of the program, that Frank Olson had been present at interrogations, that he had seen things, that he had been having second thoughts about what he was part of. In 1994, the family had Frank Olson's body exhumed. A forensic pathologist found evidence of a blunt blow to the head that had occurred before the fall. No one has ever been charged. No official conclusion has been reached. The case remains, officially, unsolved. Frank Olson was the only documented death directly connected to MKUltra. He was not the only person whose life was destroyed by it. By the early 1960s, MKUltra had begun to wind down, not because anyone had had a crisis of conscience, but because the science wasn't producing the results Gottlieb had hoped for. LSD, it turned out, was not a reliable truth serum. It was not a reliable anything. The reactions it produced were too unpredictable, too dependent on set and setting, too impossible to control in the conditions where the CIA actually needed to use it. A drug that made one subject cooperative might make another subject violent, catatonic, or permanently psychotic. As Sidney Gottlieb himself would later testify to the United States Senate, in closed session, using a pseudonym, his identity hidden even from the congressional record for decades, MKUltra was, in his assessment, probably not a high payoff program. Not a high payoff program. That was his conclusion, after 20 years, after 149 sub-projects, after experiments conducted on thousands of people without their consent, after at least one documented death, after lives permanently altered and minds permanently broken. Not a high payoff program. The official MKUltra program was scaled back in the mid-1960s. A successor program called MK Search continued some of the research, but the golden age of the CIA's mind control experiments was over. And in January 1973, as Richard Nixon's presidency began to unravel and congressional investigators started looking at the CIA's domestic activities with increasing suspicion, CIA Director Richard Helms gave an order: destroy the files. All of them. Every document related to MKUltra. Every record of every experiment. Every name of every subject. Every piece of paper that connected the United States government to what had been done. Helms was thorough. His people were thorough. Boxes of documents were fed through shredders and burned. 2 decades of records, gone in a matter of days. Almost. Because someone, somewhere in the CIA's bureaucratic machinery, had filed a set of MKUltra financial documents in the wrong place. Not with the program's operational records. With the budget and fiscal section. A clerical error. The kind of mistake that happens in any large organization. The shredders missed them. In 1977, following a Freedom of Information Act request filed by journalist John Marks, those documents were found. 20,000 pages. Not the full record. That was gone forever. But enough. Enough to confirm that the program had existed. Enough to trace its funding. Enough to name the institutions and the researchers. Enough to drag it all into the light. The Senate convened hearings. Witnesses were called. Sidney Gottlieb testified in closed session, his identity concealed, under the pseudonym Joseph Scheider. He was calm, cooperative. He answered questions in careful, measured language. He expressed some regret. He was never charged with a crime. Richard Helms was never charged with a crime for ordering the destruction of federal evidence. George Hunter White had died in 1975, before the full extent of his work became public. Ewan Cameron, the Canadian psychiatrist who had spent years erasing his patients' minds, had died in 1967. He never faced consequences of any kind. No one went to prison for MKUltra, not one person. In 1953, a man named Whitey Bulger was serving time in a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. He was 23 years old. He volunteered for what he was told was a medical study aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. For more than a year, he was given LSD every single day. Bulger would later become one of the most notorious organized crime figures in American history. The head of the Winter Hill Gang in Boston, an FBI informant, a killer. His story has been told in books and films and countless investigations. But he never forgot what was done to him at Atlanta. In a letter written decades later, he described it: the nightmares that never stopped, the sense that something fundamental had been broken inside him, the paranoia that settled in and never fully left. He was not the only one. In the mid-1950s, the CIA dosed an Army officer named James Thornwell with LSD during an interrogation in France, after he was suspected of leaking classified documents. Thornwell's mental state deteriorated dramatically. He spent years in and out of psychiatric institutions. He eventually received a settlement from the government, though not before his life had been effectively dismantled. There was Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a novel about the abuse of power in a psychiatric institution, who received his first dose of LSD in a CIA-funded experiment at Stanford. He did not know at the time where the drug had come from. He described the experience as transformative, and went on to spread LSD culture across America, becoming one of the central figures of the 1960s counterculture. And Robert Hunter, lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet. All of them first encountered LSD through experiments funded, directly or indirectly, by Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA. There is a profound irony buried in this. The agency that hoped LSD would give them control over the human mind instead, accidentally, gave it to the generation that would use it to tear down every institution the CIA existed to protect. The drug that was meant to be a weapon became a sacrament. The CIA brought LSD to America, and America used it to revolt. But behind that irony are real people, real damage, real lives. The Senate hearings in 1977 established that over 30 institutions had participated in MKUltra. More than 180 researchers. Experiments conducted at every social level, the powerful and the powerless, citizens and foreign nationals, the willing and the unwitting. The deputy director of the CIA testified that the agency itself acknowledged the experiments had made, in his words, little scientific sense. The agents monitoring them were not qualified observers. The subjects were often inaccessible beyond the first hours of the test. Follow-up was impossible. They had destroyed lives for data they couldn't even use. Most of the people who were subjected to these experiments never knew. The full list of subjects was in those files that Richard Helms ordered burned. It no longer exists. The people who were dosed at Operation Midnight Climax never knew they were part of a government program. They probably went home thinking they'd had the strangest night of their lives. Some of them may still be alive today. They will never know. And that, in the end, may be the most disturbing thing about MKUltra. Not the scale, not the money, not even the deaths. The silence. The fact that there are people walking around right now who were experimented on by their own government, who were used without consent, whose minds were touched and altered by something they never asked for, and who have no idea, who will never know. Sidney Gottlieb retired from the CIA in 1973. The same year Helms ordered the files destroyed. He moved to a small property in the Virginia countryside. He worked with terminally ill patients. He studied Eastern philosophy. By the accounts of people who knew him in those years, he was a kind man, thoughtful, gentle. He died in 1999. He was never charged with a crime. In 2001, some additional MKUltra documents were declassified. In 2024, a new collection was published by the National Security Archive, drawing on decades of Freedom of Information requests and congressional records. New details emerged, new names, new sub-projects, new evidence of the breadth of what had been done. The story is still not fully told. It may never be. What we know is this. For 20 years, an agency of the United States government systematically violated the rights and the minds of its own citizens. It did so not in the heat of a single crisis, not under the pressure of a single moment of panic, but deliberately, methodically, and with the full knowledge and authorization of its leadership. It did so because it could, because the people being used had no power to stop it, because the institutions that were supposed to provide oversight were either complicit or unaware, and because for 20 years the secret held. The question MKUltra leaves us with is not really about LSD. It is not really about mind control, or the Cold War, or Sidney Gottlieb. The question is simpler and harder than any of those things. It is this: what else don't we know? Because MKUltra was not discovered by a whistleblower. It was not uncovered by a journalist who got a tip. It did not come to light because someone inside the program had a crisis of conscience and walked into the Washington Post. It was found because a filing clerk put documents in the wrong box. That is all that stands between 20 years of documented government crimes and the public that had a right to know about them. A clerical error. The files that were successfully destroyed. Those are gone. Whatever they contained, we will never know. The full list of subjects, the full scope of the experiments, the full accounting of what was done to how many people. That knowledge was reduced to ash in a CIA incinerator in January 1973, and it is not coming back. This is what we know. This is what was found. This is what was confirmed by Senate testimony, by declassified documents, by the sworn statements of the men who ran the program. If you've made it to the end of this story, I want to leave you with one last thing. In 1977, a senator named Ted Kennedy opened the MKUltra hearings with a statement. He said, "The deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. At least one death, that of Dr. Olson, resulted from these activities. At least one death. At least. If you found this story important, if you think it deserves to be heard, share it. Because the best protection against this kind of thing happening again is people knowing that it happened in the first place. If you want to go deeper, we have a full video on Operation Midnight Climax, and another on Frank Olson specifically coming next week. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next one.